royal marriages were rarely about love. More often, they were political alliances, calculated moves to strengthen power, secure influence, and produce heirs. Sometimes, the couples were lucky. They built a respectful relationship and, in rare cases, even fell in love. But others weren't so fortunate. For some, the nightmare started on the very first wedding night. Today, I'll tell you about royal marriages that went terribly wrong, right from night one. Anne of Cleves went down in history as Henry VIII's ugliest wife, but she was also the luckiest. Unlike others, she kept her head. Still, she had to share a bed with him on their wedding night. But Anne, 24 years younger than Henry and considered attractive by German standards, failed to please him from the moment they met. To be fair, by 1540, Henry was an aging, obese man with a festering, foul-smelling leg wound. Still, Anne wasn't necessarily the problem. More likely, Henry's resentment was aimed at Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged the match. Thomas Cromwell later recalled that Henry told him after the public reception at Greenwich on 3rd January that Ian was nothing as well as she was spoken of. Still, Anne of Cleves married Henry VIII at Greenwich Palace on January 6, 1540. The ceremony was lavish, full of royal pageantry, but behind closed doors, it was already falling apart. That night, things went from bad to worse. By morning, Henry told Cromwell, "I liked her before not well, but now I like her much worse." He admitted he couldn't consummate the marriage, meaning their union wasn't even legally sealed. The marriage was annulled just 6 months later, with Cromwell stating, "Many times His Majesty has declared unto him that his nature has abhorred her ever since, so far that if His Grace would go about to have ado with her, His Highness verily thinks that his nature would not consent to do so." Henry and Cromwell also used cruel and graphic descriptions of Anne's body to explain why their marriage was unconsummated. These descriptions predictably direct the blame firmly away from the king. After all, questioning Henry's ability to consummate the marriage would have insulted his pride and masculinity. Anne received full news of the annulment only 3 days before it was finalised, but showed no resistance. She returned her wedding ring and asked for it to be broken into pieces, as a thing in which she had known no force nor virtue. As a gesture of gratitude for her cooperation, and likely to avoid conflict with her powerful family, Henry granted his former queen a generous settlement and the honorary title of the King's Sister. Anne remained unmarried for the rest of her life. Henry VIII soon married Catherine Howard, and Thomas Cromwell was executed on the very day of their wedding. The wedding night of Anne of Austria and Louis XIII also ended in disaster. Their marriage, part of a grand political alliance, took place in 1615, when both were just 14 years old. A key figure behind the arrangement was the young king's mother and regent, Marie de Medici, an ambitious woman with a hunger for power. For her, it was crucial that this advantageous union be consummated immediately. The young king himself was a shy and reserved person, and although his bride, Anne, was a renowned beauty, a rare exception for the Habsburg lineage from which she came, and one of the most sought-after princesses in Europe, the very thought of publicly consummating the marriage filled Louis with dread. Although Louis managed to perform his duty on their wedding night, the humiliating experience of public consummation left him deeply scarred. The pious and physically fragile king reportedly felt shame and great fear, and for the next 4 years, he made no effort to share a bed with his wife. Instead, he visited her morning and evening, merely to observe court protocol. Anne, for her part, didn't seem too upset by this arrangement. She wasn't particularly fond of her husband, and appeared far more taken with the splendour and intrigue of the French court. However, the pressure to produce an heir eventually brought the royal couple closer. But despite several pregnancies, each ended in miscarriage. The long-awaited heir was finally born in 1638, after a thunderstorm prevented Louis from reaching Saint-Maur-des-Fossés, forcing him to spend the night with Anne at the Louvre. The royal child was seen as a gift from heaven, and that child would go on to become one of the most iconic monarchs in history, Louis XIV, the Sun King. A fellow unfortunate of Anne of Cleves could be Queen Ingeborg of Denmark, whose dream of wearing a crown collapsed on her very wedding night. but her fate was far more tragic. Ingeborg's engagement and her planned marriage to Philip II Augustus was originally part of a political strategy to claim the English throne. But by the time the bride finally arrived, after a 6-month journey, the plans had changed. She was no longer needed and no longer wanted. Despite the sudden change in plans, the wedding still went ahead on August 14th, 1193. But the very next day, after an unconsummated wedding night, Philip II banished Ingeborg. He even suggested that the Danish envoys take her back home, but she refused to leave France, a land she now considered her own. By November 5th, the king had secured an annulment and soon remarried, but Ingeborg refused to surrender quietly. She wrote directly to the Pope, pleading for protection. In response, Philip imprisoned his former wife for 20 years. She was held in a castle under harsh conditions, humiliated, poorly fed, and denied medical care. The Pope, horrified by her treatment, eventually excommunicated the king, forcing him to reconsider. In 1213, Philip finally recognised their marriage once again and restored her title as queen. Despite all she had endured, Ingeborg rejoiced in her release. For the remaining 10 years of Philip's life, they lived together like brother and sister. In his will, Philip left her 10,000 marks, a final acknowledgement of the injustice he had done. In 1223, Ingeborg became the Queen Dowager of France. As these stories show, happily ever after doesn't always begin with a royal wedding. Which of these tales surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments. And see you in the next video.